Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to our part two of our G100 working group on Teams, and we're really focusing on external access issues and information governance around that. I'm Joy Heath Rush, and I'm the CEO of ILTA. We have joining us today Michelle Gilbert from Microsoft, and we also have some team members from Kraft Kennedy. We have Dan, Joe, and Chris. Paul Edlund from Microsoft was originally planning to join us and may be able to toward the end of this, but he had a family situation arise that he needed to take care of. So we appreciate that we've got folks pinch hitting. Many of you, if not all, that are on the call now attended our part one last week where we talked about aspects of Teams external access. And Michelle did a really good level setting kind of presentation around what is possible with external access, the difference between federation and guest access, and some of the issues around that. And it turned out that I've gotten lots of offline comments about how helpful it was to get everybody kind of to a common base of knowledge. So today we have no presentation. This is really a conversation and a discussion of use cases. And so we've got some experts on the phone to help us. I'm going to tee up the first use case because it's one that came up in a conversation yesterday. One CIO asked another, are you allowing clients to participate in teams that you host in your tenancy? And if so, what form is that taking? So first of all, I'm gonna ask either the Kraft Kennedy team or Michelle to comment on what you're seeing, what kinds of questions people are asking about this, and then I'd like to explore some of the pros and cons of this and some of the technical and information governance issues that we have to explore. And I would encourage everybody, we're not doing any kind of presentation today. This is totally conversation. So please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, put something in the chat. I can recognize you, but I want this to be an open conversation. So between Michelle, Dan, who wants to start on this particular use case?
I can lead off with an answer, and this is Dan from Kraft Kennedy. I think in the conversations that I've had, particularly in my larger law firm clients, that there is a desire to accommodate the use of the attorneys, the staff, and that the demand is there to support external access. I think the greatest challenge really with teams and in this way is figuring out how to do that in a way that doesn't compromise the integrity of the information being shared, that you are able to bring people in who who they are, that they are able to see what they are supposed to see and not see what they're not supposed to see. And that you have control over that entire process through the life cycle of that process. Someone will be brought in, they will have standing access for some time, and then eventually they'll be removed and do all of that life cycle management while meeting the rest of the security design and security posture of the firm. If you have a requirement for MFA, you still want to enforce that. If you have a requirement for being on a recognized machine or something to that effect, you want ways of enforcing your security policy for your data as much as possible.
So if I can summarize that answer a little bit, Dan, what I'm hearing is that there's a kind of an inherent challenge in taking external accounts and applying the same level of account management rigor to those that you would of someone who was internal to your environment. So that is managing expiration of passwords, managing multi-factor authentication, managing just the fact that they've left their organization or maybe left their role. So is that kind of a good summary of what you were just talking about?
Two of those three things. So MFA and general presence within a partner organization, yes. The one about passwords, you don't necessarily have a strong control over that. You do need to trust your partner organization to vet their own passwords in the way that they choose to do so. And you may have a requirement that any partner organization have and maintain certain controls around their credential management that are acceptable to you, the firm hosting data, to make sure that whatever they're doing is acceptable to you, and presumptively vice versa. There's also a conversation about the retention of data. Once a file is accessed, and once someone is able to access a file, if they're able to expatriate it, how do you retain control over it? Do you let them take it off your control, off your SharePoint site or OneDrive site? And then this entire conversation gets split again, in the sense that there are two types of external or non-firm entities, right? There's a guest account, which is someone known to another tenant, right? A partner, counsel, a vendor, but someone who we can put a finger on and identify. And then there's sort of this vague external user where it's just kind of open published, and anybody can access it with a link that's shared out, and the controls there may be different between those two styles of access, or you may prefer one but not the other.
So using probably the thumbs up or in the emotion reaction section, those of you who are participating, have you had requests from clients to access your teams and your tenant? Or requests from lawyers to have people access the teams and the tenant?
Sorry, Joy. I had an incoming call as you were asking a question. Sorry about that. Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, sure. No problem, Roz. Is that, have you had requests either from your clients or from your lawyers to allow clients in and access to a team's workspace in your tenant? Yes, absolutely. So I see Kevin, I see Raz, definitely Bo. So Kevin, can I call on you a little bit to talk about what kinds of requests you're getting and why, what you've done with it? Have you acceded to that request, or what are some of the barriers to moving forward with that?
Yeah, Joy, I can certainly start and share just in a nutshell what we're doing at the moment. And I took, maybe a liberal interpretation of the idea of request, because while we've had lawyers and clients request it, we've also proposed it, because we see some benefits of moving to this platform as an alternative to, I think, the many other ways that we try to collaborate with clients. So there's some other things that we'd like to move away from and consolidate more in the Microsoft platform environment and the like. And so in the context of that, we are right in the midst. These conversations are so well timed for me, but we're right in the midst of piloting with a bundle of clients and other third parties, the external guest access. And so we had rolled out Teams early on in the pandemic, including the collaborative channel spaces. Late summer, early fall, we rolled out and kind of did a similar pilot phase around how you would use Teams for delivery of a client matter. We had a specifically crafted service designed for use for a client matter, as opposed to general collaboration inside the firm. And so we're following that footprint of piloting the external guest access. And so we're trying to work through a number of questions. We've got everything from what I'd call a strategic key client interaction, where we really want to offer Teams as a supplement to managing that strategic relationship with a client, down to particular instances where, like a co-counsel type of situation, where we have matters or maybe a portfolio of matters that we're working with another firm or group of lawyers on. And this provides a great way to collaborate, coordinate, and kind of project plan, as well as share files. All the way down to situations where we're actually thinking that Teams guest access is probably too much, and we want to be able to do file and folder share to a particular person that's involved in a matter, but not comprehensively across the matter. And so we're looking at that kind of functionality just at the file folder level as a supplement to what we would do across the team space for guests. And so we've got these things all sort of, we're coming out of the phase of doing the technical pilot. There's a few features that we're waiting for that are in the Microsoft roadmap, but we have opened it up. We've got probably about a dozen external team spaces in operation right now. And we hope to grow that to about 30 sites through the course of this pilot as we learn what works. One of the things that I'm really interested in seeing from it is not only how do we solve all these governance issues that we talk about and the information security things, which are of course of significant concern to us as well, but I'm also interested to see how do clients actually engage in it, and does it become something that they see as a positive supplement and begin to move out of email as we've seen the shift internal to the firm. Or is it kind of too hard to get there? Do they not really engage? And I think we'll see a little bit of a mix for that. Again, we sort of put that in relation to the many other extranet style and other file sharing sites, which are, which are a step outside, or at least a couple of steps outside of your normal workflows during the day, both for the client and for the lawyer. And so those things often sit like it's an unattended island off in the middle that you only go to when you have to. And so I think to get the value out of Teams, we need people to use it, less so to accomplish a specific objective and more so to engage in a meaningful way. So
yeah, the engagement point is a fantastic one, because one of the things that can happen with kind of dedicated collaboration or file sharing sites, and it's just human nature, they end up becoming destinations for a specific purpose, and then data sits out there forever, and it ends up becoming another repository that's not necessarily managed. So I'm very interested in how far you've gotten, Kevin, so far with your pilot. So I'm going to pick on you one more time, and then I'm going to go to one of the other people who raised their hands. So Dan talked about some of the things of managing external access. So managing multi-factor authentication, the way that you would manage your internal accounts. So through your pilot, what methods have you tried, Kevin, and what kind of processes have you developed around those management of external guest accounts?
Sure, great question, Joy. And I don't think we're done, by the way, would be the first answer, or the first part of my answer. And in fact, learn some things that I've asked my technical team to investigate on the prior session, where we will further advance that. Mm-hmm. The first thing we did before opening up guest access is we applied labels and policies to the entire the entire established base of our internal Teams collaboration environment. And those labels and policies prevent somebody from adding an external guest to a team site where we did not intend it to be. And so that was step one. Then that allowed us to turn on at the tenant level the guest access and be able to invite it into sites that were not prevented by that policy, which I think on that day was only one test site that we had set up, team site meaning. And so we've done that kind of control to protect the rest of the environment from accidental guest invitation. And then we've also configured the Teams guest access review. I think it's called access review, where the owner of the team site will get periodically, we're setting it up every 90 days at this point, they'll get a list of the guests that are a member of their site. They'll get a recommendation based on that individual's usage over the prior 30 to 90 days. And then based on that usage, there will be a recommendation of whether the person ought to continue as a guest on that site. And we've configured it, there's a number of options in how to do this. We've configured it so that if the owner takes no action, then the recommendation will be implemented. Mm-hmm. So if the person has been dormant for the last couple of months, they'll get removed. And then if the owner believes that it should happen, then they can always get re-added efficiently. I asked a question, we're still trying to get our head around the idea that there are some benefits that come to us with this environment that were hard to, or if not impossible to replicate with the old extranet sites. So the idea that person A at client.com is, they're now joining through their, I'll call it their home ID. So if they're an O365 customer at the client as well, then it's essentially using the authentication method that exists within their environment and then authorizing them access back to our site that's also in the big Microsoft cloud. And so when we think about MFA and all those kind of things, we're starting with the idea that we've got better controls around the idea that their home tenant is authorizing their identity in addition to just a generic, completely independent ID for an extranet site. And we were always worried in the past where that person could have walked out of the employment of their, our client, and they walk out the door with an active account, and it's unlikely that the clouds or the planets are going to align and the right people know and tell the right other people to get that ID shut down on a timely basis. And so that's just one of the features that we like about the concept. In addition to that, we are looking at additional MFA type factors. We're looking at which of the situations where is that home tenant protection not in place, either because the client firm is not an O365 client or they're not a Microsoft-based environment at all, and things like that. So yeah, Joy, hopefully that answered your question.
No, it was great. And just to show you kind of, I've never done security and network administration in the cloud. The way I think about this from my background is trusted domains. It sounds like the Office, the O365 tenants are working almost like trusted domains would have worked within, or trusted subnets within your internal network. So that's, I have to connect it to my old knowledge. So that's probably the way I think of it. Michelle, I saw you nodding quite a bit while Kevin was talking. So obviously some of the things he said were resonating with you. So can you comment on the things that struck you and maybe something you would either reinforce, yep, that was a great best practice, or something that you might do differently?
Yeah, I think that was really great to hear, Kevin, just the upside of using Teams, knowing that it is using a trusted identity coming into your environment, as opposed to in the past, you'd have to provide the clients, for instance, an extranet ID for them to come in. However, there was really no easy way to track if they left a firm, for instance, but they still had access to those files inside of your environment. So I think that to me is probably one of a huge upside when you think of being able to get clients access to your information, but not have to be the owner of their identity. So now you can feel rest assured that if they do leave the firm automatically or leave, their company, for instance, that they no longer will have access to that data.
So Chris just came off onto video, so I suspect he might have a comment to make about this.
Well, absolutely on the point of access review. I think that's a giant issue or a giant importance within Teams for several reasons, but certainly guest access is number one. Understanding, where people have access to your content that are not in your organization is certainly very important, but it also, that process or that just having a mechanism that's both checking where people are tied to Teams, but also where people are tied to recurring meetings is a very important one, because you can add someone to a recurring meeting on a one-off basis, and that person is basically still in that meeting in perpetuity until you remove that person. So access review as a process to really nail down and validate exactly who you want to be in a team, in a meeting, in any sort of the Azure AD component that falls into these categories is a very important item for sure, and should be part of anybody's processes when they're deploying Teams.
Yeah, one of the interesting use cases this brings up for me is access by expert witnesses. So at least in my experience, it's very common for experts to be individual consultants They might be associated with the university, and they often have a Gmail account or something like that. You might not have another O365 tenancy. So I'm going to put that idea in the parking lot. But what it says is that as we look at bringing more clients or people into our teams that are external, thinking about what their O365 environment is, and maybe part of the conversation. Dan, I saw you also unmute your video. I suspect you have a comment you want to add here as well.
Yes, I actually have a firm who I did quite a bit of work with in setting up a process by which they could set up teams, and they had a very unique structure that they wanted to do, where there was litigation across multiple firms, multiple attorneys, kind of from all over, as well as a number of separate expert testimony providers that they wanted to keep all of the conversations between themselves and kind of each of the other outside entities, whether they were of counsel, whether they were an expert, whatever their role was, to be separate from each other, but yet still kind of coalesced into one logical unit that they could flip through the different pages and work between. And so they were able to successfully use private channels fairly successfully, where they would stand up a team for the litigation effort, and then a number of private channels to facilitate conversation between themselves, the firm themselves, and each of the different of counsel firms, and then additionally, each of the additional test experts who were providing information. That's worked out well for them. There is a little bit of a scale issue, where if you are doing private channels, you can only have 30 of them. Seems like a reasonable number, but as we all know, the amount of granularity requested by the attorneys can sometimes cross lines that may be applicable in other industries, but may not be sufficient for ours. But they've used that very successfully, and they're quite happy with it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. As I hear you speak, Dan, I'm thinking about all the times when we were setting up for large depositions, and we would take the whole floor of the conference room, because you think about it as physical rooms. This room over here is where the expert was sitting, and you could go in and consult with them. This room over here is where the client was sitting. You could go in and consult with them, or co-counsel were here and you could go in and consult with them. There are different dynamics that are happening. I think particularly in litigation, with sets of conversations that would require different private channels. And the idea is, if you have them all in your one kind of team's workspace. So I think that's a second issue I'm gonna put in the parking lot, so I wanna get back to that. I wanna kind of finish working through this management of external access. Then I wanna go to who owns files, and then we'll come back to that. So Michelle, again, it looks like you might have a comment you want to make on this.
No, I just completely agree. I think Dan was really proposing or showcasing a very typical scenario that we're seeing. And I think what some of the considerations is thinking through planning, using teams and private channels in this manner to scale, and to really think through architecturally how to best design that so you don't run up against these limits. And of course, we know with Microsoft, limits can be increased over time as we add more capabilities. So as far as the limit for private channels being 30, for sure that's current status, but it's unsure in the future if that could even be increased. So then you start to think about, well, then do we use it or architect it in another way so we don't run up against that limit?
Hey, Joe, I saw you came onto video. Did you have a comment you want to make here?
Yeah, I was actually jumping in the next section once we move into files and all that stuff. I think
great, excellent. And Roz just came onto video, and I know he's one of the people who's talked about bringing clients into your team's environment. So Roz also always has the best backgrounds. I just have to say, I always like his background.
Yeah, this is basically the last time you're going to see this one because we're changing the brand tomorrow. It's going to be interesting. New logo and everything. Basically, one of the things that we've done, and this is in response to some of the comments earlier on about how do we manage the access that people have within the organization, and also how do we make sure that they abide to the same regulation that we want for our users. What we've done to make sure that happens is making sure that we have some strict conditional access policies in place, because with those you can enforce things like MFA, and you can enforce all sorts of things. Even if those external users don't have those things in their tenants, you can enforce them and they will be kind of using them from our tenant. So they will be setting up an MFA to log in into our team's environment and, I don't know, look at documents and stuff like that, but they will be setting up a specific token on their authenticator to log in into our environment if they don't have anything like this. So there are all sorts of ways of making sure that from a security perspective, everything is there and everything is sorted. The other thing that we are looking into, and most likely we're going to go live with a solution in a few months, it's a third-party application that basically manages the entire, not just the access, but it manages how teams are being used and how much they're being utilized. So you have things like bots that will go on different channels and say, well, hey, I see that no one has talked in this channel at all in the last, I don't know, 6 months, whatever we set it up to be. Or orphan teams, for example. So teams that were created and they have owners that left the firm or something like that. We basically go around and say, this team will be closed, it will be archived, and all external access will be revoked in case we're talking about guest users and so on. So you have third-party tools that can automatically take care of all of this for you. You just put in some regulations, and those tools will basically, in the back end, they will look through your teams. They will discuss with your users directly in a very nice and friendly chat-like robot thing. And they will manage the environment for you rather than you having teams and teams of IT people dealing with these kind of scenarios. Yeah, so this is something that we're working on at this point.
Yeah, I think what you brought up, Raz, it's kind of saying, I think we kind of danced around it a little bit, but making sure that you're using guest access as opposed to external access, because you have complete control over that end to end at that point, inclusive of the retention. So when someone's doing guest access in your tenant, you now control the retention of whatever chats and such that are going on in that particular collaboration set. Whereas if you're dealing it from an external perspective, yes, there are feature limits, but there's also some nuances with how those things are governed. So I think pretty much when we're talking about here today, it's going to be exclusively guest access because that's going to get you what you want.
Correct.
So again, I always like to kind of summarize things. I hope that helps the people who are listening, particularly on the recording. So I think what I'm hearing is that essentially you're using the other organization, your client, for example, O365 tenant, really just for account, knowing that their account is valid, right? That they're a valid user in that O365. You're using your O365 tenant basically in platform as a service for the team's configuration, hosting teams. And the reason you can do that is because you're using guest access, which means that your tenant is the one that controls it. So I see some nodding. So it's nice to know that an old dog can learn new tricks. And I want to tie that back to something Kevin said that I was struck by, is how they had architected their overall settings and teams right out of the gate to be prepared for external access, guest access, once they were able to put that into place, which seems to me was the right way to do it. Durgesh, I saw you come onto video. Did you have a comment you want to make?
I just have a question for Raz. He mentioned that they're looking at a product. I was wondering, Raz, if you can share what product are you looking for that overall kind of teams management and managing the team sprawl that typically happens when you kind of open up. That was one. And the other question I was asking is, when it comes to allowing people to set up a new team, right? I understand the guest access can be controlled through a lot of different layers. When it comes to actually allowing people to set up teams, have you thought about just allowing anyone and everyone in your organization to set up a new team? Or are you allowing only certain groups, kind of like what your SharePoint extranets or SharePoint team sites were used to be, where only IT gets to set up the teams out of the gates in the beginning? So 2 questions.
So the product is the one that Modality does. So Modality is a Microsoft partner that work in the unified comms sector. They have a product that takes care of all of this. I can't tell you exactly what the name is right now, but I can find out by the end of this meeting, and I'll put it in the chat. But the firm who creates the product is called Modality. Okay. They're one of our partners, so this is why we basically went with their product. That's one. And second, yes, we did actually open up the Teams to be utilized as a platform for all our users. We've been using Teams for quite some time now. We are fully migrated with voice to Teams as well. So we moved from Skype for Business to Teams. So literally, we're using the full suite of what Teams is offering right now. And yes, all the people in the organization have the right to create a team. Keep in mind that when you're talking about a group of 4,000 users that are all or E5 licensed, then those limits in terms of how many teams you can create, how many external guest access you can have in the organization, those limits are quite high and quite difficult to reach in the first place. If on top of that, you're putting a product like this one that monitors the environment and makes sure that people are not creating silly things in the environment that are not being used, then eventually what you end up with is a system that kind of manages itself out. The reason why we allowed people to do this is because we didn't want to script how people are using Teams. We wanted people to use the platform the way they feel is right to use the platform in the way that works for them. The feedback from the organization was absolutely fabulous because obviously they were able to do things that we probably never thought they were able to do, and not something that we could prescribe in the first place. Mm-hmm. And we trust our users enough to make sure that allowing them to do something like this wouldn't immediately raise, like, I don't know, create few thousands of teams in like 24 hours. So we're now, I think, somewhere around a few hundred teams. And this is literally what the users created, either for their own departments, for their own needs, for matchers as well, and so on. We have templates, so people can use a template for a specific purpose, or they can just create a team in the way they see fit. And I think that works very well. And we're using them even from an IT perspective. We're using them with our vendors, and we're collaborating there extremely well. The vendors are editing their documentation, which is kept within our environment, encrypted using our own keys, and so on. And we control access to that data. So if we want to cut access to that data tomorrow, and that vendor shouldn't have access to the data starting tomorrow, they won't. Although it's data that they maintain. So I don't know, for example, the networking provider, the people who are giving us networks, they keep the network, the WAN diagrams and all of that, all the changes and everything that we're doing in our environment, they keep all of that documentation up to date themselves. We don't have to do it for them, or we don't have to download stuff from somewhere, put it in our environment, and then make sure that different copies of that same document are maintained and so on. Everything is up to date as you go into that team space. So from a collaboration perspective is absolutely fantastic. And the feedback from the lawyers is great. We also have, so you have stuff in Cloud App Security, as I think we discussed in the last meeting a little bit about Cloud App Security, where you can have all sorts of reports of documents and so on. We actually have a specific type of report that looks at documents that are tagged with a specific tag, that you only have in the document management system. So we know if a document was taken out of the document management system and uploaded into Teams for collaboration purposes. And we can trace that document. We can go and say, well, this document hasn't been edited for quite some time. It's from the DMS. Can you just make sure that changes are being put back and the document is removed from there if that's not where it's supposed to be? So we trust our users to be, let's call them responsible adults. And we, yes, exactly. And we allow them to actually open up Teams on their own. So they can start Teams. We have no restrictions on that.
That's great. Thanks, Raz.
No worries.
So before we move off of the issue of accounts and into files, because Raz brings up a great use case there with the vendors, I'm going to see if I can pick on Bo, because we were on another call yesterday where he was talking about how they manage client access to Teams. And as I recall, you're even considering or have set up client-only private channels within your Teams that are hosted in your tenant. So Bo, you want to talk a little bit about how far you've progressed in this area and how you're managing these external accounts?
Sure. So I'm not going to go on camera because I'm on vacation in Colorado and I'm looking a little rough this morning. But with that said, though, we've been using really Teams from the beginning. We do have clients interacting with our litigation teams. We also do have experts, like you mentioned, Joy, and we are starting to use private channels to segment information inside the teams. It's working. I mean, I still have some reservations about private channels, and so we don't allow, the only person actually in the firm other than our global admins who can create private channels is me right now. And it's just, we want to make sure that we're really judicious in the use of private channels, and we just don't open them up to the world right away. So we want to make sure we understand how they work. So we are being a little more cautious with them, I guess. But we do have some teams where we're interacting with our clients, and we have private channels just for our attorneys, private channels where experts can interact with people. And then we do have one team where we have a private channel that only the client has access to. I don't know if they're utilizing it. Our attorneys requested it. I don't know. I kind of doubt if our clients are using it, or the client is using it, but I don't have access. I mean, I could grant myself access and go look, but I doubt it. I'm not sure the benefit of that.
So is there anybody else who wants to add anything on the issue of managing the guest access or external access, clients coming in, how you deal with all the various account related issues? Anything else anyone wants to add on that before we move on to the issue of file sharing?
So I'd just like to add a little bit. I mean, we've historically used SharePoint on-prem for our client extranets, and I mean, in the past, really the only way we could decide whether an account was active or not was just last logon time, and so we would expire accounts if they weren't used for 60 days, and I never felt like that was a great way to do things, but it is what it is, and that's what we've done with our on-prem extranets. But I mean, Office 365 adds so many new capabilities, and the cloud app security lets us do a ton of different things there. And so I just think that for the people that are worried about this, you have more options with Teams and SharePoint Online and MCAS to really control these accounts and see what's being shared with people. And you can do a lot of things like revoke access to files if they haven't been touched in X number of days, or encrypt them. And you've got more tools. And then apparently there's even cooler tools out there that I didn't even know about. So I'm looking forward to learning what those products are, and hopefully they're not expensive.
Well, one of my takeaways here, I'm going to circle back to Kevin's original comments about the difference between using Teams to collaborate and using extranets, it feels to me, based on various conversations, that a lot of organizations are going into the guest or external access to teams kind of with the extranet mindset of how accounts have to be managed and all of that, instead of going back and saying, what's the problem we're trying to solve, which is having invalid accounts, all those kinds of things. And do we have tools within the platform that let us manage that in a different way that's more holistic, that's less manual? So that was an important takeaway for me. And I was also struck when Roz was talking about the modality tool set, is that it really feels to me like those original tools that came out to manage workspaces in the document management system that kind of automated the templates for the workspace and all of those kinds of things. So any
and in fact, Joy, I mean, I almost think it's interesting because I almost think it's like that type of tool set, but on the back end. You know, the infrastructure guy in me thinks back to deduplication. It's like, is it happening as it comes in, or is it happening after it's stored? And I mean, that tool set was absolutely I am determining what's happening after things get created and making sure I have some data management capabilities to allow people to create infinitely, but keep everything under control. And that's an interesting dichotomy that's not usually out there in the law firm world. And the other side that we see are people that use something like Prospero or CAM or write some of their own tools that are managing the intake and treating teams creation like a matter intake process, so that things are structured on the way in. And certainly, you know, a checkbox for external access required is being noted on the way in, so that the data management is, you know, proliferated. But that modality tool allowing people more freedom up front, and then basically just ensuring that they're not using it for, you know, goofy stuff, I think was the word, and things that aren't being used are deprecated so that they don't count against your totals. That's good to have options on both sides so that you can really tailor it to how your firm works.
Oh, it's learning lessons from extranets and workspace management and bringing them into this different collaboration environment. So, hey,
yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to add, thanks, Joy. You know, what we have never had, which within SharePoint, is the ability to do this guest access review. And so bringing that and having that be a part of Azure Active Directory and Teams, now you have a lot more capabilities. But I wanted to also touch on a couple of the things that I had heard around private channels, around who can invite a guest. So if you joined last week or had watched the recording on our first in this two-part series, I talked through guest access at length as to the granular type of controls that you can put in place. So if you're thinking of, you know, we don't want to open up private channels to everyone, you can set a policy to say only this group of individuals can create private channels. They are authorized. They understand what it is, why they would be created, as well as who can. I love the concept of using unified labeling system or sensitivity labels on Teams that will block guests from ever accessing. And so then maybe another label that does allow guests. And then within that, having a subset of individuals who understand the invitation process that is authorized to invite guests into the tenant. So it doesn't have to necessarily be IT controlled. This is, you know, entrusting that someone is trained, they understand the process, and they are now authorized. So, you know, before I think we had an all or nothing kind of type of environment in extranets within SharePoint, either online or SharePoint on-prem. I've certainly built them. Now we have a lot more granularity, and I think that's a game changer. And as well as having all the controls that have come out in the last year to be able to put, you know, security in place to feel more comfortable to do that guest enablement.
Yeah, and I'll tie that one back to Roz's comment about, and I called it, you know, using your own tenant as your platform as a service. If you're the one that's hosting it, it doesn't matter what the policies are in the other tenant. They're just managing the fact that that person belongs there and is a valid user and hasn't left and all that. But you're really running the policies based on the policies, the information governance that you've set in your environment. And that's very attractive. So we're going to go over now to the issue of file sharing. And certainly when we talk about kind of chat, I'm sure all of us would much rather have all the chat in one place than on people's cell phones that they're texting and all the different things. And that direct messaging capability, I suspect, was probably the number one reason so many people put in Teams, early in the pandemic. They were really trying to get this enterprise direct messaging capability. But then, of course, people want to share files. And at least in the conversations I've been a part of, this issue of what to do, I'll call it with the files tab in Teams, is probably the most controversial one. Well, I have a document management system. I don't want to point people at SharePoint or OneDrive. I want, or I want to make sure I have custody of the documents. I don't want somebody else to have custody of the documents. Document ownership is a huge issue. I know from a conversation I was in yesterday, some clients want to invite your lawyers into their tenant and their team's environment because they want to keep custody of the files. So I just want to explore, first of all, what the range of issues is around file sharing for collaboration and kind of the context of external access and guest access, as well as document custody. So Joe, I know that you specifically unmuted video to talk about files. So I'm going to pick on you first to kind of give us your thoughts about some of the decision factors or some of the range of use cases you've seen around file sharing in Teams.
Yeah, so I think I wanted to cover, we kind of touched on it a little bit in the last section, but I kind of think it makes sense to kind of bring it home during this conversation. So I would say, this is kind of the catalyst for the M365 for Legal initiative, is that concern around files. What do you do? What do you not do? Are you waiting for document management integration? Do you want to do something sooner? So for those that have seen what has been discussed on the ILTA webinar series, for those that might have had their MTC event, or maybe it's coming up, those are the things that can be configured so that you say, all right, if I don't want to open up this Pandora's box, I want to wait for my document system of authority, my DMS platform, to provide that native integration, hopefully later this year, then that is available to you. That's the steps that ourselves and other qualified partners can help you walk through, get you to the point where that stuff is locked down. You are not concerned about those information governance potential risks because you're not exposing that. You're just dealing with chat, you're dealing with meetings, but there's no ability for users to share files through the files tab, through chats. Seeing that up front is important so that you know what the end user experience will be, but that is something that's possible and that can get you there. If you're comfortable with that, then I think it's really more around tooling and control to make sure that if you do decide to go down the native files path today in advance or in lieu of document management system integration, that you put the appropriate controls in place. And that's what I wanted to touch on from earlier. There's really two key pieces, I'll call them native to the Microsoft 365 cloud, that make that very easy and flexible. One is, I would say it's on the auditing and control, which is cloud app security. And the other is truly governance and classification and protection, which is Azure Information Protection or Microsoft Information Protection. So from an MCAS or Microsoft Cloud App Security perspective, we touched on this a little bit. I know Raz brought it up and some others. So that's where, really anything is possible. If you're going to start looking at files, you want to make sure who's accessing it. Are you preventing it from going to outside repositories like Box or Dropbox? If someone does try to download content, do you want to ensure that that action fires a protection action with something like AIP so that that content is encrypted with rights management protection? Do you want to look at things like risky sessions, apply some intelligence to access and say, look, I trust you, but if you're in an impossible travel scenario where normally Microsoft has seen you access during these types of windows of time and in these geographic locations, but in 5 minutes you log in from Chicago and then Paris, France, that's not possible. Do I want to fire some alerts? Do I want to lock that down? This is something that you should be doing internally, but it absolutely applies to external folks as well, because they're accessing your content. You're blurring the lines there between external folks and internal folks once you start breaking down those barriers of content access. So I think that's an important piece to look into. If you do expose that, making sure you put appropriate rules in place with MCAS or some other solution, but MCAS is first party to protect that. On the flip side of that, in terms of content, if you do expose external access to Teams, and this extends beyond it, this can go to email, to USB drives, to whatever you want to do. Sensitive content that you've deemed as sensitive, either because end users have designated it as such, You have automatically classified it as such because of the content within it, looking for things like keywords, sensitive information qualifiers, document fingerprinting, all of the mechanisms that are at your disposal, applying protection to it to not just protect access, but encrypt the content so that if it does go out, let's say you have trusted someone into your Teams tenant, you've allowed them to download content because maybe it's their content, maybe it's a client, and it's a document that they're paying your attorneys to help develop for them. If you want to let them have it, that's great. You still have the control. You can ensure that they can't forward it to someone else and allow them access. If you suspect that that person has been compromised themselves, you can revoke that access and start over. Anytime you're starting to pivot outside of your document management system, which has some very defined walls, you want to be looking at solutions like that or third parties. Again, this is a first party solution, so that you do maintain that control wherever it goes, who touches it, who doesn't touch it, all of those things. So whenever we have a Teams conversation, usually it's starting with Teams, and that's been the case for the last 14 months or so. It's always okay, Teams is great. What else do you need to hook into it to make sure that you're protected and that you are addressing those information governance concerns? And that immediately shifts to MCAS and AIP specifically, and then potentially some other third-party solutions like Prosperware CAM, Raz brought up modality. There's other pieces that can fill holes and make sure that you are covered from those different angles.
Hey, that was an excellent overview. Does anyone want to add anything to what Joe was just talking about? I guess I'd really like to explore the pros and cons of sharing files using Teams. I mean, I know that really steps back and simplifies the conversation a little bit, but I believe that that's where the conversation starts. And I'm guessing, Joe, you talked about what happens when you sit down and start configuring Teams or setting up Teams with a client. I'm guessing that this question of do we or do we not files is one of the first things that comes up. And what are the issues that people want to talk about in that respect? Because it sounds to me from what you're saying that if the answer is yes, we do want to do files, there's lots of tools, whether they're first-party tools, whether they're third-party tools, that help us manage that in the way we want to manage it. But it comes back to that fundamental question, do we Teams or do we not? And what are the issues that people are exploring when they're making that decision of do we files or do we not files in Teams?
And I think the important thing to ask there is, what do you do today? How do you collaborate today? And if the answer is I don't, I do all my stuff internally and then I send stuff to my clients, then okay, then maybe that answers the question for you. But if you have, or maybe you don't know you have, the whole shadow IT stuff, if folks are sharing this content anyway through email, through Box, through some other tools, and it could be a myriad of tools, then if the cat's been out of the bag, at least put it in a bag that you control and that you have more controls over it, and say, look, I'm going to support you in doing what you are already doing anyway, but I'm going to do it in a platform that is more robust, is tightly integrated, has IT controls, can have information governance applied to it, so that you are heading off those other means, which could ultimately lead to data loss or data leak.
I think a lot about kind of the advent of Office 365 years ago and the value add of using SharePoint as opposed to email. And that's really what we're talking about here. It's not necessarily Teams, it's SharePoint. It is the Files tab within Teams, which in the past, what would happen is you would email out a file and say you email it out to 5 people. Now you have 5 copies of that file. So if they need updates, they're making their updates on those files, sending them back to someone to be able to piecemeal together all the changes back into the original file to store it back perhaps into the DMS. And so you could see if you have 5 people you've emailed and maybe you've gone back and forth and talked through the email of what you want changed in there. It's really difficult to keep track of that type of scenario where now you have this proliferation of all these different files that might have been even forwarded to other people. So all these several copies. So to me, this is all about file management and having one single source of truth. So to me, I think that's one of the huge pros of having your files living inside of Teams.
Chris, did you have a comment? It looked like you unmuted.
I think that's
to make too. Or I see.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Yeah, I was just saying I agree completely. I mean, law firms and file management. I mean, those are almost synonymous. The idea that you have hundreds of millions of documents for the people that are on this phone call that all live in a very secured, organized, and ultimately very useful and efficient document management system. That was always the problem, was the document management systems. They have built technologies to allow you to do multi-edit, or because it's not co-authoring in some cases, or document sharing and capabilities, but there were limitations. And I think the most important piece was that identity management within that was very difficult. You were sharing based on a trust factor that was never tangible. I sent an email, I sent a link, basically anyone with those links have the ability to get back into the system, or I have to manage a separate set of accounts and get back to Kevin's original issues about account fidelity. Now I have a system that is built on identity management. And, the key issue in the short term is, how do I align two repositories so that I can get that sharing down? And, there already are tools that will do synchronization. And certainly as part of this initiative with Microsoft and the legal community, the acceleration of the document management systems to get their components in there natively are going to come fast and furious. And as I tell every conversation we have with someone that's a Cisco shop that's got the full Cisco stack, this isn't a piecemeal, okay, Teams is going to handle 3 or 4 things, and then, Cisco is going to handle the rest in a long-term strategy. I mean, it's really saying, what is the more fundamental tool that's going to provide more functionality in a 5 to 10 year time frame, and ultimately be a transformational shift, adding new functionality you've never had before, adding new integrations you've never had before, and ultimately to creating a work environment that allows you to collaborate easier both internally and externally, but also maintain that security posture that ultimately is the first question you get anytime you're talking about external collaboration. I think that's really what Teams solves. But yeah, I mean, every firm's got their own little journey to get there, and I think that that's why we have so many of these conversations these days.
I think that's something where we gave feedback to the Microsoft team early on that was very positive, and said, unlike in some other false starts that we've seen, with Link trying to rip out a phone system and Matter Center trying to rip out your DMS, it's like they looked at this the right way. We gave them really candid feedback to start, and before the webinar series, and just saying, this is the right way. You're surrounding the DMS and exposing additional integrated functionality, and appreciating that there maybe never be a path off of that DMS to a Microsoft platform like SharePoint Online. That's fine. Let's get first party level integration with it to say, look, that's where your documents are, live there. Let's get with all the other functionality of Teams. Don't displace it, augment it. And that's really what this initiative was. And we're very happy to see that was the strategy taken for it.
But isn't it really, I'm thinking back to, again, circling back to some of Kevin's comments right at the beginning of our call around third-party collaboration platforms, extranet platforms and things like that. Joe, you made the comment, people are sending files back and forth by email. Michelle's like, is what we're doing here inherently superior to that? Well, yeah, but why do they keep going back to email? Because they live there. Because email is part of their workflow. And I think Kevin was making the comment about going to another destination that's not necessarily part of your workflow. And sometimes we get forced into that. I mean, I'll call out my friends at Intralinks, where I can't tell you how many times I was forced to go to Intralinks because our bank client said that's where we live and that's part of our workflow and you have to be there. And those things are always going to exist. We can't deal with a single platform, but we can decide where the things we have custody of live. So would it be your contention that one of the points that you need to discuss when considering whether to files or whether to not in Teams is whether or not whether or not the workflow is compelling enough that people really will use that files capability within Teams because they will live there in the way that they live in Outlook?
I think it's a valid question. And ultimately, I do believe that Teams is the better solution for that, call it the attorney desktop. We've all lived through Outlook being that, and it was never designed to be that. I come from a messaging background, so I could speak from a lot of experience with the large law firms that I've worked with. 15 add-ins in Outlook with large attorney mailboxes don't play well. They've never played well, especially with the third-party solutions that we see in legal, where they're not really thinking about other people in the sandbox. They kind of stomp on each other. So, and we all know the ones that we're talking about. So that was never designed to be that platform. It was an application that was tried to be shoehorned into a collaboration tool with multi-facets, and it fell over. Teams is not that. We always say that Teams, right? And Teams is really, think about it like an operating system. Teams does a bunch of stuff by itself well, but its true value is in the applications or apps that you sit on top of it and you hook into it. It truly is a framework that is designed to be tightly integrated across multiple repositories to be that desktop. You can still work in email. That's great. But it is something, again, to your point, Joy, if you integrate the right things into it, into the right ways, you will start to get that traction that people will start to live in Teams, and you probably will start to see stuff move out of email and move into Teams, whether it's chats or file sharing or whatever it is that we're talking about.
So
yeah, hey Joy, I've got
who am I hearing? Is this Bo? Because I saw Kevin and Bo both unmute. So who was just speaking?
It was Kevin, I think.
Go ahead,
I just wanted to offer 2 additional anecdotes, and I'm going to use a couple from our earlier internal only collaboration space in terms of what we saw. The first thing I'd say is when we do a good job of talking with the lawyers about what we're up to, we really emphasize that we're looking at new ways of working and not about specific technology components or platforms and the like. And so Michelle nailed it when you talk about all the friction that occurs in collaboration when you have files distributed to 10 people and somebody has to sit in the middle of that and reconcile and integrate and all those kind of things. And so new ways of working being the ability to all go to one live document and work either simultaneously or without the friction of document exchange is an incredibly valuable component. And what I found is that in describing it to the lawyers as co-authoring, it almost misses the point, because at that point they're thinking it's a gimmick. I don't need 2 to 10 people writing in a document all at the same time. And so it's not really the simultaneous, it's the fact that it's one thing to go to and you don't have to do all that exchange. And then what we found is that a couple of the lawyers that were early adopters, and we had one of our international arbitration practices that was racing on a client deadline using a 370-page document with about a dozen people all around the world in different time zones. And they picked this thing up, and at the end of a couple of weeks of working with it, they said, this is an absolute game changer for the profession, because not only were we able to remove all that friction, but we also cleared past so many of the hurdles that were inherent in the old DMS systems and the like, wherein our attorneys could be adding substantial new content to the document at the same time as our support professionals are able to clean up the footnotes, add the references, the links, and all those kind of things in there. And they found that to be a complete game changer in not needing to put pencils down for a while the professional staff were doing the cleanup and the support work. The other thing we did is we had a major doc review project where we had over 100 attorneys involved simultaneously in a major review. And they came to us and said, is there anything in your collaboration platform that would help us work more efficiently as a large group, because we're dying from all the damn reply alls with 100 people. And so we set up a team space. They started to manage their review. They had really a hierarchy of people that were super knowledgeable about the case and the content, all the way down to the contributing lawyer that has 20 hours this week to do a few documents. And we measured that in 45 days, by looking at the traffic that was inside of that one team space, we measured that they collectively avoided over 1 million emails just in a 45-day period for each of the 120 people that were on that project. And so those are different ways of working and an evolution past, I think, where we've been. And the final thing I'll say, which I think is, maybe a bit controversial or whatever, but it even leads us to the conversation of why the hell do we have a DMS? What value was it promising to deliver? And where is it relevant to where document creation and authoring and the like is going. And we think the answer is they coexist, but we don't have a strong preference for one or the other, as long as it's properly organized information. So
that was great, Kevin. Thank you. Bo, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say I told you so. Like, I've been saying this for probably 2 decades about co-authoring and how awesome it is. So, and just, I don't know if it's quite been 2 decades, but it's been a long time. And co-authoring is amazing. The other part that's amazing about SharePoint is that you can actually host OneNote files. And I mean, just the fact that iManage still can't deal with that, it blows my mind. But the co-authoring, I mean, we rolled it out with Office 2010. We had some people doing it with Office 2007, but I think with Office 2007, my memory is getting bad, but it's a game changer, like you said. I mean, we had a litigator, or the head of our like IT, like tech committee that we had back in the day. One day he came to me, he was like, co-authoring is the best thing you've ever rolled out in the history of IT at the firm. And it's been a really, you guys are just starting to realize where we've been for more than a decade. And we do use SharePoint as a DMS. It's viable. I'm not sure that Teams is viable as a DMS. I mean, there's just some hardcore usability issues that Microsoft has to address. And I mean, hopefully, I'm sure they're working on it, but just the inability to find a channel and then pivot to other channels in an easy way is just, it's a non-starter for a lot of attorneys. And it's just super painful the way you have to do it right now. And just be cautious about that part as you roll this out to everyone, because SharePoint is viable. Teams for 100 matters, I don't think is viable. And that's the part that we've got to all work on and figure out.
Well, and part of the importance of this conversation is getting into the conversation quickly enough with folks from Microsoft and from the partners, hearing what it is that we're struggling with, and and having things go in that direction. I do want to talk just a minute about co-authoring, because I think that we always need to be careful about how we use that term. That is, there's the situation where you're not taking a bunch of externally supplied documents, copies coming by email, and trying to rationalize the changes into the copy you own in the document management system. The next step from that is people being able to access the real document and do things they need to do with it, but not necessarily all kind of making changes at the same time. There's still, I mean, one of the things that culturally we have to deal with in law firms is the hierarchical nature of collaboration. That is, a first-year associate's input is not equal to the managing partner's input. It's just not, and we're not there yet. But the use case Kevin provides of letting the support staff be in there marking for table of authorities, marking for table of contents, doing all of those things that are serial normally and add time, or cite or shepherdizing, the cites in the document. You take that from being a serial process to having things happen at the same time. So it's also figuring out kind of what your culture is about co-authoring, as opposed to co-authoring in like a Google Docs world where everybody's equal and everybody's in them making changes at the same time. So there's a little bit of figuring that out. So when we get to this conversation, I guess, about custody, so I want to pull together the clients having access to our teams externally and the issue of document custody, and then sometimes clients inviting us into their team's environments. What are the technical and workflow issues that we're having conversations about when it comes to document custody? Now, if a client comes to you and says, hey, I want you to be in my team, be in our team's tenant because we want to keep control of the documents, when your lawyer wants to keep control of the documents, is that a place where IT can help, or is that purely a relationship conversation that has to be had? What is there a technology way we can help them solve that problem? I either asked a really good question or a really bad question. There's nothing in between. I'm not sure which
I'll throw out an answer to a very small subset of that. And one of those challenges is going to be the identity perspective when you have your lawyer working and somebody else's tenant, especially when you're also a team's tenant. I work in 3 different tenants at this point, and switching between tenants is not. Yeah, exactly.
I have 5.
Yeah, it's not exactly the easiest concept to understand. And what is really starts to be a challenge is when, again, some of these security metrics that we've talked about absolutely have a different capability when someone is a guest versus an external party. And in many of these same tenants, I have both of those entities that exist in there. So someone IM me as a guest, and now that is a chat that is sitting in their tenant that I don't necessarily see on all my devices, as opposed to when they chat to me as an external user, which comes to my home tenant, and when I'm in my home tenant, I see that and can respond immediately. So there's definitely a little bit of workflow that's the challenge. Where IT can help is mostly based on some training and some, we'll say, acknowledging and pushing the continued development of the Teams and Azure ID platform and things like user voice for Microsoft, so that they continue to solve the key problems that affect law firms. You know, they are a big proponent of using user voice as their strategy of development and what is the next thing that they do. And so whenever we hit a really strong roadblock, we publish that pretty heavily, even into the ILTA community sometimes, to try to get those votes up, because we know they affect law firms. So that's, I think, is certainly one of the challenges, and one of the things that IT needs to at least have a plan for, of if someone needs to work in somebody else's tenant, how to help them make the most efficient capability there, and make sure that it's as least confusing as possible for them.
So for our law firms on the call, do you have lawyers who have joined the teams in the client's environment? And is that something that the lawyer asked you about first? And how would you have advised them? Any comments on that? Roz has one. Yay.
Yeah, so we definitely have people who joined other tenants. I know that for a fact. I, for one, am joining at least 5 or 6 tenants. And we don't ask people to come to us in any way. I don't think we could really restrict them from accessing someone else's tenant per se. But I don't necessarily see a problem with that, because most of the times, if you're talking about a client tenant, then they're responsible for securing their data, and they own that data. So the way that data is being secured is exactly as the client requested, because they are the ones securing it. So there's not going to be a further discussion in terms of, well, you as the lawyers are not securing our data the way we want it secured, because, well, it's on their tenant. They are responsible for that. So every time you are joining from your organization, you're joining another organization, you kind of have to abide by that organization's rules. It doesn't mean that you lose your MFA, for example, because you still log in with MFA if you have MFA on your account, but you actually work in that environment. You're then the guest, as we discussed earlier. You're the guest in that environment. So you can get your access cut off. You can get all sorts of stuff removed or added to your privileges as that organization sees fit. I don't think really that this is something that we need to control from my perspective. This is something that people should be able to do as that comes along, if that situation comes along.
Raz, just so you know, there is a way for you to control which tenants your users log into. Setting aside the question of whether you should or should not place that restriction, I guess for the benefit of everyone else, that there is a way to control that if you're interested.
Yeah, we never looked into that because we never saw a benefits into restricting that part. So that's why I was like, I don't know. I always looked at other people coming into my organization because obviously that's the data that I am responsible for securing. This is why I know about conditional access and all the guest access controls and all of that. So yes, we really looked into that part, but not really with our users going into another organization. But I don't really understand where we see an issue with us as users of tenant X joining a tenant Y for getting some data from there or working with some data there.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a technical issue so much as it is a cultural issue. And
why would it be even a cultural issue? So you basically work in someone else's environment. If that's the client's environment, awesome. That's where they want their documents to be stored.
And I'm actually right with, I see, is that Kevin? Go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say it's come up in conversation with our general counsel. We don't think it's new to Teams, but in these instances, we just feel that we as a firm need to have some mechanism to retain a copy of our work product. And so there's been some question about, how far are we going or how much might we be leaving behind in these instances? We don't think that we're going to be in a position by any means to tell a client no, but it probably comes down more to the work practices associated with work product retention and having a copy of that at the point that we close the matter. So.
Yeah, that's cool. We have the same, I think, perspective as Kevin there, where, it's a risk. It's not cultural. It's not even technological. It's almost a risk management issue. How do you know? And we've had this problem, before the days of Teams where someone says, well, hey, the client just wants everything shoved in Google Drive. And, part of the problem is one, if they're co-authoring in Google Drive, because we know, as people have already attested, people do like the co-authoring, right? Now your original work product's there. And if at some point the client says, hey, this is over, and they close access, and your attorneys did not grab that stuff, you basically have lost your intellectual property on that matter. You may or may not be able to gain access to it again. I think the other problem that we have is we don't always know how they've set up their team's security, right? So we know our team's security, and because we require MFA, they might be, the MFA will be enforced and such, but I don't know what they're doing on that other side. And unfortunately, we have so many clients, especially in the emerging companies area, they just click out of the box and away they're going. It could be Teams, it could be G Suite, could be Dropbox, you name it. And our general counsel's concern has always been, well, how do we know what they set up? Right. In the last 2 weeks, I've had 2 calls with clients for business email compromise because they didn't use MFA on their Office 365 exchange, right? So which means if they're using Teams, they probably don't have MFA set up there either. Those are some of the, I think, are risk management concerns. I do agree a bit with Roz that it's like, well, hey, if that's what the client wants to do and they want to act recklessly, but I know that our general counsel feels a little differently about it.
I think that's something that's not going to go away. That's a good point. Has anyone on this call or anyone heard of, one of yourselves? If a client of yours is asking you to work in their tenant and that's what they insist upon, have you given them a security standards document that says, okay, we'll do that, but you have to satisfy these 10 things that we believe are a minimum set of security requirements for us to work within your tenants?
Reverse outside counsel guidelines. I love it.
Exactly.
It's close. Actually, we haven't done it for Teams yet because I haven't gotten the request, but G Suite, Dropbox, even Box, if a client is insistent that we're going to use their system, it's not necessarily a list of security requirements, but our general counsel has come up with a disclaimer language, which she actually got from a couple of other firms, that says, look, we don't recommend you do this, and you're assuming all security responsibility for anything that happens here. Like this is not our deal. So it is kind of reverse. It's at least reverse limitation of liability, right? And so we do make them agree to that just through email. We don't require any signatures or anything, that they understand the dangers of what they're doing. And part of it stems from, and I wish I could remember the case, but my general counsel found this where there was an attorney storing stuff in Dropbox, and the courts want, and of course it got broken into or whatever, hacked. And the courts said that it was the liability of the attorney because the courts equated to using Dropbox as the same as leaving a box of files on a park bench. So, I know technically we all understand that that's not really true as security people, right? But from general counsel's point of view, sometimes she's like, it doesn't matter what the technical things matter. It matters for us, it's what the courts think, right? And if this is what the judge thinks, then that's what judges think. If this is the precedent set, then that's the reality that they have to face. So, but yeah, we do that language. It's disclaimer language.
And actually, the law firm general counsel, Mike, and thank you, share a fair amount of that. There's a group that some of you are probably familiar with a gentleman named Jim Jones, not the Guyana cult Kool-Aid guy, but he's the chairman emeritus of Arnold and Porter. And he's retired now, but he runs this series of roundtables for large firm and mid-sized firm general counsel. And they get together quarterly, either in person or virtually. And one of the segments of their meeting every single time is it's literally half a day. And they go through all of the interesting cases that have happened in the previous quarter affecting law firms, and things like exactly what Mike's talking about, or anything else in kind of the information governance and risk area. And then they talk about it as a group, and they share things like this, like these disclaimers and stuff. So I'm not surprised to hear that, but you all may be hearing more about it from your general counsel if this is starting to proliferate kind of in that community.
I do have something to add, so if I may. So for us, we do tell our lawyers that their duty as lawyers is to store the documents in the primary firm repository. So they always take a copy of the data from that tenant and put it in the DMS. Even when we're talking about collaboration on Teams, we tell them you can collaborate on Teams, you can exchange documents on Teams. That is not the approved firm repository of data. Therefore, you edit the document there, or the client makes changes there, you need to take a copy of that and upload it into iManage. So this is something that the lawyers are instructed to do based on their working patterns. And this is something that our GC was quite adamant about, quite clear. The repository doesn't change. We offer you this additional sharing environment where you can do this kind of stuff, but the data needs to always come back into iManage. To your point, Mike, earlier, yes, if they shut down the connection to their tenant, that's fine, because a copy of that data should exist in our DMS, and this is the lawyer's job. Is not ours as IT to make sure that the files reside in the right jurisdiction. Also, if you're saying that the clients on the other side may not have the right security, we always tell them this is the type of security you're going to have, but always this is a kind of a consultancy type of thing, because again, you're very correct. You have a disclaimer where you say, if you want to use that, then fine, you have that responsibility. And there's nothing stopping those clients right now from receiving the document in the most secure way possible, by email, TLS, or encrypted email in the cloud, and then saving that file into their Dropbox. There's nothing stopping them from doing so. Asking us to work there, yes, we can tell them you should be doing that, and we have all these type of other options from our side, which we can give you some of them for free and no strings attached and so on. And we can offer you all these things to not use things like Dropbox and Box and whatever. But if they want to use those, then we say, okay, fine, sign here, off you go.
Well, I think that's where you can use AIP. So, whether you put paper policies in place or something like that to say, okay, we're going to work with your tenant, you sign over your firstborn and you're all good to go. That's great. Put AIP encryption on it. So that way, if they do compromise it in some way, then you, as the owner of the document, if that's the case, you can revoke that access to it.
Yeah, but that's the problem. We are not actually owners of the document. Ultimately, the client is the owner of the document. So we cannot put AIP in place unless the client agrees. And this was one of the discussions that we've been having with our internal team as well, because as soon as we deployed the labels and everybody was happy, oh yeah, we can secure documents, excellent, let's do that. And then clients came back like, what are you doing here? Why do I have to just go in and log in every time I open this document? What was this all about? Can you take that stuff out? Because that's their document. We are securing the document for them, but it doesn't belong to us as law firms. It's not really our IP in the end. At least in UK, it's not our IP. And we've been discussing this with our GC in length, because we want to use mining tools to actually go through that IP that exists in our DMS, and our GC saying no, because that's not our data. And we cannot mine that data without the consent of all of those clients. It's their files. We cannot go through them as if they were ours. Because if a client goes away, you have to give the client the file. And you have to remove that file from your system, which means it doesn't belong to you as a law firm. It belongs to the client. And that's something that a lot of GCs are not necessarily seeing it exactly like that. So it depends on the firm. But from our perspective, the file belongs to the client. We're just securing it for them. So we're taking care of it. It's in our jurisdiction. They entrusted it to us as their trusted advisors, but it's their data. And we are responsible for securing that data as long as it is with us. When it is with them, they're entrusted to actually secure that data. It's not our responsibility to secure the data that they own and have.
Well, Roz,
I think you've encapsulated the entire issue that we deal with, I think, in this very unique industry as we consider all of these technology tools and how to apply them. Is this huge ecosystem that we work with and exchange information within in order to represent our clients. And so well said. I totally agree with you.
Well, gentlemen, you've had the last word. We're right at the end of our time. I hope you have all found this valuable and enjoyable. I know I have. Thank you, Michelle, Chris, Dan, Joe, for coming in and offering your expertise. Thanks to everybody who participated in the session. And if you like this kind of programming, and these kinds of activities, drop me a note. Say, hey, we like this, do more of it. Be on the lookout. Our next roundtable working group series will be starting soon, where we're going to be talking about issues that are relate to return to the office, that are things like health check-in applications, and but also things like the long-term view of remote work and what that means for IT. So be on the lookout for that. I'll be publishing the schedule soon. And again, thank you very much. I will be making the recording available to everybody, and we really appreciate you participating. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Joy.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.